One last round of analysis for this year in review with my guest in Washington, D.C., Amaka Anku. So 2019, this broad trend continued where other large economies say they want to engage more with Africa. They want to invest more and trade more. Russia is the latest of this lot. But what's really triggering this renewed attention, particularly from Russia?
You know, it's hard to say. It feels like we see this sort of cycle every 9-10 years or so, right? Around 2010, we saw the last excitement about Africa. But I think that at the core of it is just the fact or the reality that Africa is sort of the last region of the world. You know, it's one of the only two fastest growing regions in the world. It's the last region where you don't have markets that are saturated. You still have a lot of people who are in poverty, who can grow disposable income and become consumers, right? And so there's a general sense of, are we positioning ourselves to be competitive when disposable incomes do take off and consumers do grow exponentially on this continent, right? So I think that's what's driving it.
Are policymakers taking this engagement seriously? Because you look at the quality of deals that are being struck around trade, around investment, for instance. Are policymakers here looking for the best possible terms of engagement?
Yeah, I think that's up for debate. I think, one of the things that is, I would say, very valid criticism is that, Africa as a continent and even specific African countries have never really quite defined or articulated what their strategy is for engagement with the global, with the world, right? It's not clear, what they want to get out of trade. It's not clear what they want to get out of strategic engagements, even with China, for example. It all seems to be opportunistic. That being said, I do see that the rising competition in terms of financial flows, right? The fact that you're seeing more and more flows of finance and capital from China, not only to fund big infrastructure projects that are designed and coordinated by government, but also to the private sector, particularly to tech. That's created a little bit more leverage from African countries to be able to say, look, we can get finance from Western countries or we can get it from China, and who's going to give us the best deal? I just haven't seen different countries really be thoughtful and deliberate about exactly what the strategy is, what they want to get out of it, and then pursue that clearly. So, I hope that changes.
Right. One last question for you. Some of the big macro trends that we're seeing across the world, the China-US trade on one hand and Brexit on the other, these will rumble on into 2020. How would African economies be affected, and what do they need to prepare themselves for?
That's a hard question. Africa as a continent is so marginal to the global economy, right? Africa's economy as a whole is only about over 2% of the global economy. And that means that it's been relatively insulated from, global trade tensions. There are few countries on the continent, like South Africa, who are somewhat impacted by tariffs on steel, for example. So I think that presents both an opportunity and a risk, right? The opportunity is that because you're insulated, you can continue to chart your own course. And we've seen that there, countries like China, in part because of the trade tensions with the U.S., are taking things like technology in Africa more seriously, right? Because if China is locked out of technology, things like SIMs, manufactured in the U.S., China, having access to a 1.2 billion per person market and potentially 3.5 trillion market can give it a serious advantage in the race to 5G, for example, and just the cold tech war. That's the way in which it could be negative if these countries are not being strategic about how they engage, right? But I see both an opportunity to be valuable in the fact, that you have this vast market that hasn't been tapped, and also a risk because there could be a downturn in demand for global commodities, and that's what most African countries are selling. commodities. So if the trade tensions between the U.S. and China slows down global growth, it will have an impact on Africa.
Indeed. Amaka Anku in Washington, D.C., thank you very much for your insights on the program.